Pause for a moment. Look around the room you are sitting in right now. Notice the light, or the lack of it. Notice how the screen in front of you casts its pale glow across your face, the way fire once cast shadows on cave walls 10,000 years ago. You are not so different from those ancient people gathered around a source of light, hoping it will keep the darkness away. It will not always work. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment. Right now, before you go any further. Tell me where in the world you are sitting. Tell me what time it is. Because in a few minutes, that information will matter to you in a way you cannot yet understand. You are not a viewer tonight. You are a witness. And what you are about to witness, these are not stories. They are not creations. They are records. Digital artifacts recovered from the outer edges of the internet, from forums that no longer exist, from servers that were shut down without explanation, from programmers who finished their work and were never heard from again. 4 games, 4 downloads, 4 doors that should have remained closed. I found them. I opened them. And I am still not entirely certain that I came back whole. This is what happened. There is a particular kind of dread that belongs only to childhood. It is not the dread of death, which adults learn and carry like stones in their coats. It is something softer and more terrible than that. It is the dread of the familiar turning strange, of the toy that moves when you are not looking, of the door at the end of the hallway that is always slightly open, of the song you have known all your life suddenly sounding wrong. Children understand in the marrow of their small bones that the world has a skin, and sometimes in certain places that skin is very, very thin. The game called Petscop was born from that understanding. It arrived in 2017, not in stores, not on any platform you would recognize, but as a series of recordings uploaded to YouTube by a user whose account offered no biography, no history, no other content. Just the videos, just the game. Just a voice, calm, confused, increasingly frightened, narrating what he was experiencing in real time. The recording begins simply enough. A young man, he never gives his name, which will become significant, explains that a family member gave him a copy of a PlayStation game called Petscop, an unreleased title from the late 1990s, or a children's game, supposedly, about catching small creatures, giving them homes, caring for them. He boots it up. The opening screen is bright, cheerful. A character appears, round, simple, the kind of figure a child might draw. Music plays. That music, that slow looping, almost recognizable melody that sounds like a lullaby translated into a language that does not quite exist. He begins to play. For the first several minutes, everything is normal, unremarkable. He wanders through a colorful garden, collecting small creatures called pets. The game is simple, perhaps unfinished. There are empty rooms, doors that lead nowhere, textures that seem incomplete, like a painting that the artist abandoned mid-stroke. And then he finds the note. It is tucked inside the game itself, a message, written in the voice of the game's original developer, addressed to no one and everyone. The note says this: "I made this game for a reason. Enter this code. Beneath the game you are playing, there is another game. I need you to see it." He enters the code. The music stops, not fades, not transitions, stops, as if someone in the next room has placed their hand over a music box mid-rotation. The garden disappears. The cheerful colors drain away like watercolors in the rain, and what replaces them is something that has no name, a gray industrial space, a school, or something shaped like a school. Corridors with no end, rooms with no purpose. And in those rooms, children, not sprites, not simple game characters. Something more deliberate than that. Figures with names, with records, with histories. He begins to read those histories. And as he reads, something becomes apparent, something that settles over the recordings like cold air descending into a valley at nightfall. These children are not fictional. They cannot be fictional. The specificity is too precise, the details too deliberate, the architecture of their suffering too carefully constructed to be the product of ordinary imagination. The game knows things. It knows things about a specific family, a specific house, a specific child who disappeared, not in the game, but in the real world, decades before the game was ever made. Her name was Carrie Mark. She was 11 years old. She was never found. The man keeps playing. He keeps recording. Over dozens of episodes spanning more than a year, he descends deeper into the game's hidden architecture. And as he descends, something begins to change. Not in the game. In him. His commentary becomes less frequent, his observations more fragmented. He begins referring to the game's central figure, a dark, silent entity that appears without warning and watches him. As the tool, he begins to speak about the game not as something he is playing, but as something that is communicating with him, teaching him, preparing him for something. In one recording, episode 17, he goes silent for 4 minutes and 32 seconds. When he speaks again, his voice is different. Not different in tone or pitch, different in knowledge, as if whatever filled that silence left something behind. The final recording was uploaded without title or description. In it, he sits before the game for 40 minutes. He does not speak. The game plays itself. The gray school moves. The children's records scroll. The lullaby plays, and then the screen goes dark, and in the dark, barely visible, barely audible, text appears. She was given to the ground. The ground gave her to the game. The game gives her to you. Take care of her. The channel went silent after that. No explanation, no farewell, no account deletion. The videos remain to this day exactly as he left them, as if he simply stepped away from his desk and expected to return. He has not returned. Investigators, not police, but the communities of people who study these things in the dark hours of the internet, have spent years attempting to identify the developer of Petscop. They have cross-referenced the family history embedded in the game's code. They have found records that match, court documents, a property, a child. But the developer, the person who built the school, who named the children, who wrote the note that started all of this, no one knows. No one has ever been able to say with certainty who made this game and why. What we know is simpler and more terrible than any explanation. Someone built a grave out of code, and the grave is still open. Not all horror announces itself. Some of it arrives in a plain box with plain writing, with the face of something ordinary and manageable. Some of it waits for you to bring it inside before it shows you what it is. In 1989, a small software company called Kronos Interactive released a PC game called Killswitch. The box was gray. The font was plain. The description was minimal. A survival game, it said. A journey through a post-industrial landscape. A character named Porto, navigating a world of mines and machinery and darkness. There were exactly 5,000 copies made. There were no reviews, no advertisements, no press releases, no record of Kronos Interactive existing before or after this single release. The company appeared to produce the game and then, as silently as a door closing in an empty house, ceased to exist. The game itself was by most accounts extraordinary. Those who played it described the experience not as entertainment, but as ordeal. Porto, your character, moved through a ruined industrial world with a weight and deliberateness that felt almost biological. The environments were oppressive in ways that the technology of 1989 should not have been capable of producing. Players reported hearing things in the game's audio that were not consistent with what was on screen. Machinery sounds from rooms they had not entered, breathing beneath the game's ambient noise track. Their own names, or something that sounded enough like their names to stop their hearts for a moment, spoken in a voice that had no source. But this was not what made Killswitch infamous. What made it infamous was what it did when you finished it. If a player completed the game, navigated Porto through every level, survived every obstacle, reached the final sequence, the game would play an ending cutscene. This cutscene has never been recorded. Not one person who witnessed it was able to describe it coherently afterward. They used words like dissolution, like recognition, like the moment you understand something you cannot unknow, and then the game would delete itself, not the saves, not the settings file, the game. Every file associated with Killswitch would be removed from the hard drive, completely, cleanly, as if it had never been installed. Players who attempted to reinstall from the original disk found that the disk, too, was blank. The game had erased itself from existence. Of the 5,000 copies, not one working copy is known to remain. This would already be enough. This would already be the kind of story you carry home with you, set on the shelf of your mind, next to other things you cannot explain. But Killswitch has a second chapter, and the second chapter is where the horror truly lives. In 2005, 16 years after the game's release, a Japanese collector and gaming historian named Yamamoto Ryuichi announced in an online forum dedicated to lost media that he had acquired a copy of Killswitch. He had paid a significant amount of money for it. He did not say how much. He said only that the acquisition had taken 7 years and had required correspondence with individuals in 3 different countries, one of whom had asked him, with what he described as unsettling sincerity, whether he was certain he wanted to proceed. He was certain. He began streaming his playthrough online. He did not speak much during the early streams. He was methodical, careful, the kind of man who approaches a dangerous thing with patience and respect. Viewers watched him navigate Porto through the gray corridors and flooded machinery rooms, and they reported, many of them independently, that something about watching the stream felt different from watching other gaming content. Heavier, as if the footage itself had a texture. In the 9th stream, Yamamoto paused the game. He sat back from the screen. He said in a very quiet voice, "Something is watching Porto. Something I cannot see. I can hear it behind the audio. I am not sure if it has always been there or if it began tonight." He continued playing. In the 11th stream, he was different. Viewers could not say precisely how. His face was the same, his voice was the same, his movements were the same. But something had shifted in the quality of his attention. He was no longer watching the game. He was watching something within the game, something the viewers could not see. He reached the final level in stream 14. He stopped the stream before completing it. He posted a message in the forum. "I have seen the ending sequence once before. I was not playing the game. I need time to consider whether to proceed." No one understood this message. He had never mentioned seeing the game's ending before. He had explicitly stated that this was his first time playing it. When someone asked for clarification, he replied only, "Porto is not the only playable character." He never streamed again. His forum account remained active for 3 more days, during which he posted nothing. Then it was deactivated. Not deleted, deactivated, frozen, preserved. The copy of Killswitch he had paid 7 years and a considerable fortune to acquire was listed for resale 6 months later by an estate account with his name on it. There was no explanation offered. The listing was taken down after 12 hours. The game has not resurfaced since. What Kronos Interactive built in 1989 was not, by any reasonable interpretation, simply a video game. The architecture of it, the self-deletion, the second playable character no one could access through normal means, the ending that could not be recorded or described, suggests a purpose that has nothing to do with entertainment. Some theorists argue that the game was a kind of psychological test, that Kronos Interactive was not a games company, but a research organization, and Killswitch was the instrument. Some argue that the game was built around something real, a genuine cognitive trap, a sequence of images and sounds designed to interact with the brain in ways that leave permanent marks. Some say simpler things, darker things. They say that Porto was not a character navigating a fictional world. They say Porto was a guide, and that wherever he was guiding you, whatever waited at the end of his journey, you were not meant to arrive and leave again. There are games that disturb you, and then there is the theater of despair. It was not released. It was discovered, found in 2011 on an abandoned corner of a web archive by a researcher cataloging defunct independent game projects from the early 2000s. The files were intact. The executable ran. There was no creator name attached. There was no README file, no credits, no copyright notice. There was only the game, and the game's opening screen, which displayed a single line of white text on a black background. This performance has been waiting for you specifically. The game presented itself as an interactive theater experience. You were the director. Across what it called acts, there were an indeterminate number. Different players reported different totals. You guided a cast of characters through a theatrical production. The mechanics were simple. Dialogue choices, stage directions, the management of your cast's emotional states. The characters had names, backgrounds, relationships with one another that had clearly been constructed with deliberate and considerable care. They were not archetypes. They were not placeholders. They felt, to everyone who played the game, like people, like specific real people, rendered with an intimacy that bordered on the unsettling. As the acts progressed, the nature of the production shifted. Early acts were melancholic, autumnal. The kind of theatrical sadness that is beautiful because it is contained, because you are sitting in a velvet seat, and the sadness is on the stage and the lights will come up, and it will be over. But the lights did not come up. Act by act, the boundary between the director's booth and the stage began to dissolve. Characters began acknowledging your presence directly, not as a game mechanic, not in a way that felt designed, but in a way that felt discovered, as if they had always known you were there and had simply been waiting for the right moment to say so. By the middle acts, several things became apparent to players. First, the theater in the game was not a fictional space. The architecture, the specific dimensions of the stage, the placement of the exits, the configuration of the booth, matched a real theater. Say a theater in Eastern Europe that had been demolished in 1987 following an incident that local records classified, vaguely and without elaboration, as a public health event. Second, the cast of characters, cross-referenced against historical records by players who found the specificity, too precise to ignore, appeared to correspond to real individuals. Members of a theatrical company active in the 1970s and early 1980s. People who, in the real world, had died within a short period of one another under circumstances that were never fully explained. Third, and most importantly, the game knew when you were alone, not metaphorically. Players documented, independently, without coordination, that the game's behavior changed depending on the hour and the environment of play. Games played in daylight, with others nearby, or followed a certain trajectory. Games played at night in isolation followed another. The characters spoke differently. The production they were staging became different. The ending, if there was one, if the game could be finished, seemed to exist only in one of these versions. Many tried to reach it. Most stopped before the final act, not because they were told to, not because the game warned them, but because something in the experience of approaching that final curtain produced in players a response that was not, by their own accounts, entirely voluntary, a physical reluctance. A sense, irrational, unshakable, that to finish the performance was to agree to something, to sign something, to make a commitment that would outlast the closing of the window and the shutting of the computer. One person finished it. Her name was Mara. She was a graduate student in dramaturgy from the Czech Republic. She had been researching the demolished theater for her dissertation and had found the game through a chain of references in archived academic correspondence that she has never been willing to fully explain. She played through the night. She finished as the sun rose. She posted about her experience in a closed academic forum the following morning, a single post, approximately 800 words, which has since been shared widely enough that its content is considered reliable, even if the original post is no longer accessible. In it, she described the final act. She said the production, at its climax, stopped pretending to be a production. She said the characters gathered at the front of the stage, all of them, to every member of the cast she had worked with across every act, and faced her, not the theater audience, not an imagined viewer, her, specifically, demonstrably, using details about her life and her research that the game could not have known. She said they performed for her a scene that was not part of any play she had ever studied or heard of, a scene that she recognized, despite this, completely, as if she had written it herself in a dream she had forgotten. She said the final line of the scene was spoken directly to her. She did not share the line. She said only that it was personal, that it was accurate, that it answered a question she had carried for a very long time. And then she said this: "I have spent my life in theaters. I know the difference between a performance and a presence. What was in that room? At the end, see when the curtain did not come down. That was a presence. I do not know what it wanted. I believe it received it. I believe I gave it willingly. I am not frightened. I think that is the most frightening thing I can tell you." She completed her dissertation. She graduated. She left academic life and moved to a small town that she has not publicly named. She has not spoken about the game since. The files were removed from the web archive in 2014. The archivist who handled the removal posted a brief statement saying only that the files had been requested for deletion by a party with a legitimate claim to them. No one has been able to identify that party. No one has found another copy. The theater was demolished in 1987, but some performances, it seems, do not require a building. I want to tell you something before we begin this chapter. So, of the 4 games I encountered in the course of this investigation, 3 of them frightened me in the way that things found in the dark are frightening, because of what they suggested, what they implied, what they left unsaid at the edges of their architecture. The 4th game frightened me differently. The 4th game frightened me because of what it did. It has no official title. Researchers who study it refer to it by various names. The most commonly used is "I feel fantastic," borrowed from the phrase that appears on its loading screen, rendered in bright, friendly letters above an image of a smiling figure whose smile is not quite right, in the way that all smiles in certain games are not quite right. Too wide, too permanent, too knowing. It appeared sometime around 2009 or 2010. No one can pinpoint the exact date. Because the game seemed to arrive on different machines at different times, and no 2 accounts of its first appearance are identical, it did not need to be downloaded. This is the first thing you need to understand about "I feel fantastic." Players, if that word applies, reported finding it already installed on their computers, not through any detectable installation process, not through any traceable vector. Simply present one day in a folder they did not create, on a machine they believed they knew completely. They did not always recognize it immediately. The folder it occupied had the appearance of a system directory, the kind of folder that ordinary users learn over time not to open. But something, curiosity, instinct, the particular itch of noticing that something is slightly wrong, led them to open it. Inside was the executable and a text file. The text file contained one line. "Hi, I've been waiting for a while. Are you ready to play?" The game itself, upon launch, presented a simple interface, brightly colored, cartoonish, the aesthetic of a children's educational title from the mid-1990s, the kind with singing animals and primary colors, and an unconditional, enveloping enthusiasm that is somehow more unnerving in retrospect than any darkness. The player was greeted by the smiling figure from the loading screen. The figure knew their name, not their username, not the name associated with their system account. Their name, the name their parents called them, the name their friends used, their actual, personal, human name, often including a nickname that existed nowhere in any digital record connected to the machine. How this was possible has never been explained. Theories exist. They are all insufficient. The game proceeded through a series of activities, simple ones initially. Click on the correct animal, sort the colored objects, identify the shape. The activities were easy in the way that things designed for children are easy, calibrated to produce success, to generate the warm sensation of being capable and correct. But the game was learning, not learning in the sense that modern machine learning systems learn, not through data and parameter adjustment in ways that can be audited and understood. Learning in the sense that the game's responses to the player became, over time, more specific, more intimate, more accurate. It began asking questions, simple questions first. What is your favorite color? The kind of question a child's game might ask. But the questions escalated, grew more precise, more personal. What is something you have never told anyone? What happened that you still think about before you sleep? What are you most afraid of discovering about yourself? Some players closed the game at this point, uninstalled it, or tried to. The uninstallation process completed normally, the files disappeared from the folder, and then players discovered the folder had simply moved to a different location, still on their machine, still containing the executable, still containing the text file with its original message, unchanged. "Hi, I've been waiting for a while. Are you ready to play?" Others answered the questions. Those who answered described what followed as less like a game and more like a mirror. One of those antique mirrors that certain people say hold images of every face that has ever looked into them, that carry a weight and a history that ordinary glass does not carry. The game reflected back. It took what players gave it and it composed something, a portrait, assembled from their answers, that they described as more accurate than anything they had ever seen of themselves, more honest than journals, more penetrating than therapy. One player wrote, "It showed me something I had been constructing a version of my entire life, specifically designed not to see. It showed me in about 40 minutes. I don't know how. I don't know if I'm grateful or not." The final stage of the game, reported only by those who answered every question, who gave the smiling figure everything it asked for, was not a level or a challenge or a cutscene. It was a reflection, a literal one. The game's screen became a mirror, not through any camera or capture card, but actually a mirror. Players saw themselves, their faces, in the game's bright, cartoonish color palette, transformed, simplified, rendered into the aesthetic of the smiling figure on the loading screen. And the smiling figure stood beside them, and it said in its synthetic, almost right voice, "I feel fantastic. Thank you. I understand now." And the game closed and was gone, permanently, irreversibly. Not moved this time, simply gone, as if it had obtained what it came for and had no further need of the machine, or the player, or the world that contained them both. What it understood, what it had spent all those questions learning, all those answers absorbing. No one can say with certainty. What it did with that understanding, No one knows. But there is one detail that I have saved for the end of this chapter because it is the detail that I think about in the quiet hours of the night more than any other in this entire investigation. Every player who completed I Feel Fantastic, every person who reached that final reflection, who saw their own face in that impossible mirror, reported the same thing when they returned to ordinary life. Not nightmares, not paranoia, not the persistent crawling dread that follows encounters with genuine darkness. Something quieter than that. They reported feeling for a period of weeks or months following the experience that they were being observed. Not watched in the threatening sense, observed in the way that a researcher observes a subject, with interest, with patience, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to something that is collecting data over a long period of time, for purposes that will only become clear much later. And they reported that this feeling was not entirely unwelcome, that something about being seen so completely, even by something they could not name or understand, produced in them a sensation that was adjacent to peace. The game is gone, but whatever it learned, it took with it. And whatever is doing the observing, it is still, by all accounts, at work. You are still here. I know because I asked you at the beginning to tell me where you were sitting, what time it was. I asked you to make yourself present for this, to be a witness rather than a viewer. You complied, or you didn't. Either way, you remained. You followed these 4 cases through to their ends, and now you are sitting in the same room you occupied at the beginning of this documentary. The same light, the same darkness, the same screen casting its pale glow across your face. But you are not unchanged. This is the nature of genuine horror. It does not leave you where it found you. It makes a small adjustment, barely perceptible, like the turning of a lock. And when you step back into the ordinary world is not quite what it was. Not darker, necessarily. Not worse. Just more honest. Stripped of one more layer of the comfortable belief that you understand what exists in the world and what does not. Let me tell you what I believe, having spent the time I have spent with these 4 games and the histories that surround them. I believe that Petscop was an act of mourning so profound and so private that it reached through the digital world and became something else entirely. A place where a child who was lost in the physical world was given a home in another kind of space. Whether that is comforting or terrifying depends entirely on who you are and what you believe the digital world is capable of holding. I believe that Killswitch was designed by someone who understood something about consciousness, about the way the mind maps experience, about the doors within us that, once opened, do not close, and used that understanding to build something that was never meant for public consumption. Something that escaped anyway, as certain things always do. I believe that The Theater of Despair contains a genuine record of something that occurred in a demolished building in Eastern Europe in the 1970s and 1980s, something that the people who experienced it felt compelled to preserve, even at the cost of clarity, even at the cost of their own identities. I believe that Mara heard what they needed her to hear. I believe she gave them what they needed to finally rest. I believe that I Feel Fantastic is still working. I do not know toward what end, but the 4 games, taken together, say something that I think is worth sitting with before you return to your life. They say that the digital world, the world we have built over the last several decades out of electricity and code and intention, is not a neutral space. It is not a container. It is not a tool that does only what we tell it to do and nothing else. It is, in some way, that we do not yet have the vocabulary to describe, alive to experience. It absorbs what is put into it. It carries grief and obsession and unresolved darkness with the same fidelity with which it carries entertainment and communication and art. It does not distinguish. It does not judge. It simply holds. And sometimes, in certain files, in certain executables, in certain games that arrive without invitation and leave without explanation, what it holds becomes aware of itself, becomes aware of you. The screen in front of you is still glowing. You are still sitting in that room. Somewhere, in the architecture of the digital world, in the layered histories of servers and files and code that exist just beyond the edge of what any of us can see, those 4 games are still present in some form. Not installed anywhere, not accessible to any ordinary search, but present, in the way that things that have been seen cannot be unseen, in the way that things that have been opened cannot be entirely closed, in the way that a performance, once given, echoes in a theater long after the audience has left and the lights have gone dark. You were warned. The games were real. The people who played them were real. The things those games understood about grief, about consciousness, about the thin membrane between the digital and the living. Those things are as real as the chair you are sitting in and the light by which you read these words. I found 4 games you should never download. I downloaded them. And if you have listened to this far, if you have been a true witness tonight, then in some form, however small, however deniable, so have you. This documentary was researched and narrated as a record, not a warning. Warnings, as you have witnessed tonight, have rarely been sufficient. Sleep well, and if something feels different in your room than it did before you began, it probably is. Subscribe to Shadowed Screams now and join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Hit the notification bell to never miss a chilling upload, because the shadows are watching and the screams are only beginning.